One of the inspirations for the very first Legend of Zelda was Indiana Jones. And though many will take away mostly the feeling of adventure from those films, I want to focus on the fact that Jones is an archaeologist. The very first thing you see in Tears of the Kingdom after starting the game is a torch lighting up the darkness. From there, Link and Zelda continue downward and make a discovery. Murals that depict a legend from the past. Older and more devoted Legend of Zelda players might make a connection here. An ancient or archaic art form that tells us a legend, acting as a prologue for the game to come? Where have we seen that before? But each time, things are framed differently, from an oral narration provided by the Deku Tree, to the cave painting-esque skyward sword. The prologue for Tears of the Kingdom is an ancient mural found through an act of archaeology. It's a repetition of the formula, but it has been framed in a way that perfectly suits the themes of the new game, and it also acts as a subtle nod towards the series' history. Right off the bat, Tears of the Kingdom reveals a depth of theming that is rarely matched, and shows us, despite an ancient formula, how the series continues to hold such atmospheric acclaim. Chapter 1. A Leap of Faith. And before we begin, there will be spoilers for basically all of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. Other games in the mainline series are mentioned and shown, but nothing is really said in any explicit detail, so it should be fine. With that being said, let's begin. To start things off, I want to bring to light what many people, including myself, totally forgot, which was that this trailer was our first look at Tears of the Kingdom before it would get its name. Much of what you see here never made it into the game proper, which I think is a shame. I mean, how cool it would have been to ride this cute little fella. This trailer has a similar feel to what would be the prologue, but every trailer onward would reduce the level of mystery for a more exhilarating leap into the new world. And it is in the first official trailer that this leap would end up revealing the name of the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Looking back on this is quite interesting, since Link is caught in his fall by a Zonai glider, which is certainly not my experience with the ruddy things. But anyway, this all sells the game really well, but there's a part of me that has internet gamer brain that thinks that a cool, cinematic trailer with Link constructing things from Ultra Hand would have grabbed even more people's attention. This was actually what sold me specifically on the game. I was in a movie theater, of all places, and an ad for Tears of the Kingdom came out, and there was just this one moment that I latched onto where Link was driving a car of some sort, and I was like, I'm buying this. You see, my brain had made a connection between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The previous game gave us tameable wild horses, and now in its direct sequel, we would be going up in the technology tree and making cars. And so I'd already got into my head that there would be really strong and well-crafted themes here, and though I personally wasn't hooked by the leap in the trailer, the game would make it very clear, very early, that it would be more than just a marketing hook. After the prologue, Link wakes after some time has passed, much like it was in Breath of the Wild. The difference this time being that you don't just walk out into the world and go exploring. First, after you have reacclimated yourself to the basic controls in this cave area, you must step outside, and after glimpsing the majesty of the sky, you must jump. In the lead up to the game's release, I think there were concerns with it being so similar to the one that came before, that Nintendo might be resting on their laurels, to quote this IGN opinion piece. This moment to me is a bit like the dev saying, trust us. Things might seem to be the same, but make that leap of faith, and you're in for something special. That was my takeaway from that moment anyway, and Tears of the Kingdom absolutely delivers in ways that are hard to fathom. So, to understand what this game is all about, we must first go over its foundation, Breath of the Wild, which, I'm gonna admit, I haven't played. So, you're just gonna have to trust me that everything is on the level.
I hope you were able to see that breaking conventions means to change, but it can also mean to not change, to keep things as they are.
Chapter 2. Deconstruction. There are a couple of common threads when you read through the glowing reviews of Breath of the Wild. One is that the world of Hyrule gets so much lavish praise that it seems like it itself is a living character. Pay attention to this, it will be relevant later. And two is just how often people will reference other Zelda games, or the Zelda formula, and quite often the very first Legend of Zelda. This will also be relevant, nudge nudge wink wink. These comparisons do add context to why these reviewers feel the way they do about the game, but I think there's more going on here.
Whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight.
This is a quote from within Breath of the Wild, and for those who aren't aware, this line references not just other games within the series, but the titles of games in the series. It's not surprising that the reviewers are calling to the history of the series because the game itself does so as well. From the view of the developers, breaking the fourth wall here makes sense. You reference the games which solidified conventions so that your breaking them feels that much more fresh. But this isn't an outright destruction of the formula. Many reviews also bring up how faithful this game feels to Zelda, and the developers themselves spoke about the need to keep things faithful.
In 2016, Zelda celebrated its 30th anniversary with the support of all its fans. Breath of the Wild is a culmination of this long history of development. It is a new game, but at the same time, re-examines the fun that lies at the essence of the franchise.
This is deconstruction. Breaking conventions and keeping things faithful requires you to understand what to keep and what to get rid of, and the end result of that process in game form can be taken as a statement on what is The Legend of Zelda. For as much criticism as the game gets for having an incredibly simple story or a lack of character work, I err toward this being part of the point, a showcase of a more natural, essential Zelda game. For example, some people have bemoaned the change from the classical dungeon to the smaller scale but much more numerous shrine. This was explicitly a convention that was broken, and to me it makes a lot of sense. Zelda isn't Zelda because of dungeons that litter the world. The point of the vast majority of dungeons is to teach you things. Usually how to use a newly acquired item. They test your understanding of some kind of mechanic, and then when you find something similar in Hyrule proper, you apply that knowledge to progress. All that's been done is that it's been reduced down to a more pure, one could say, natural form. I think it's quite easy to apply this to other aspects of the game, like story and character. Those things were stripped of more flavor because, one, they're not essential, just ask Mario, and two, they may act as a distraction to the very new, unconventional style of play that the developers wanted to focus on. The concept of multiplicity and the new physics and chemistry engine that not just drive play in Breath of the Wild, but make the world feel real, is much more important. And so we get a very simple battle between good and evil, being played out by the characters of Link, Zelda, and Ganon, who reprise archetypal roles in every game. Some people took issue with this. For instance, some were a bit miffed that Ganon had no presence, no sweeping lines or sophisticated schemes. Which is, to me, a baffling complaint given the various forms of Ganon over the years, like when he was just a big pig, or even in the lauded Ocarina of Time when battling his first form is this. A big centipede turning into a giant boar as manifestations of malice in a game that's ostensibly about taming the wilds feels rather appropriate.
Ganon was born out of a dark past. He is a pure embodiment of the ancient evil that is reborn time and time again.
Ganon plays the role of the bad guy. Whether it be a pig or a centipede, he does a thing that is bad, and that's how it always is. It's Zelda. Well, no. Zelda's the one who makes some kind of loss or sacrifice, but you get it. It's the Legend of Zelda. This simplicity of character and story, to me, reveals the underlying formula that lies at the heart of the series. It's actually really thematic, since this essence that the developers talk about is not unlike the title, Breath of the Wild. Both speak to a state of nature and a discovery of natural forces. A direct sequel then, especially one with Kingdom in the title, might just build off of that natural complexity with something more handmade. Chapter 3. Building. Tears of the Kingdom is kind of unique in this series because it doesn't have the freedom to be its own thing. It has to build off of what came before. This theme of building is probably the strongest theme the game has, and we can see it on almost every level, from the moment-to-moment gameplay, to the quest structures, to the story, and even in the meta-narrative. First, we'll start as close to the ground as we can and look at Ultra Hand, a mechanic that looks to me to be a dumbed-down development tool. It allows the player the ability to manipulate most game objects and stick them together. This act of stickiness is actually really important because it not only amplifies the sense of freedom that the player has, but it allows them to do something that Breath of the Wild sort of lacked, which was the ability to create. Breath of the Wild gave us the elemental system where you could manipulate, say, the nature of fire to burn stuff, for example. The beauty of Tears of the Kingdom is that now that power is directly harnessed by the player through Ultra Hand. In the previous game, the developers had to make an ice arrow to freeze things, but now every arrow is capable of freezing through a direct combining of a natural force and an arrow. Each ice arrow is now an act of creation put into the player's hands, and this idea permeates much of the gameplay. Need to move stuff from A to B? Build a horse and cart, or a car. Want to fly? Harness the power of wind and put it on a glider. It's even in combat where Ultra Hand's influence can be felt. Many of the weapons have predefined properties like reach and strength, but by being able to fuse them together, we enter a realm where the player feels a certain sense of ownership over those properties. The game might give you a halberd to outreach swords, but it's only you with the power of Ultra Hand that can make a halberd to outreach other halberd users. The shift away from pre-made weapons to this more crafted approach feels like you cobbled things together and built them with your own hands. Such is the power of this newfound stickiness. From here, if we go one level up, we might ask, okay, but why are we doing all of that building in the first place? And very similar to the other autistic building or factory simulators, the answer is to build more. But unlike those other games, you don't just build one factory to build a slightly different factory which is more efficient or does a different material, you are instead building bridges. In the moment-to-moment gameplay, the player may build literal, actual bridges, but if we look at the game's progression, things get a bit more metaphorical. The main goal is to find Zelda, but your path to doing so will generally involve meeting, solving the problems of, and connecting with the other factions.
Hold out your hand.
Once you have done that, part of their population will begin to appear in the central headquarters of the Hylians. What is happening here is a building of a bridge that connects the player's faction with the others. Do good by them, and they will not just help you, but join you, furthering trust and cooperation. And all of that is pretty standard in a video game for kids about defeating evil. You know, friendship, togetherness, yada yada yada. But remember, this is a game titled Tears of the Kingdom, and what is fundamental for the construction and running of a kingdom is exactly this kind of connection between people. Now, you may think this is a bit of a stretch, but if you think building bridges between people is not one of the intentions of this game, here is a developer talking about the theme of hands, and thus, connection. But even more important than that quote is the game being able to speak for itself, and typically it's in the first tutorial that teaches you the core of what you'll be doing in any given game. Mario's first screen is lauded for this very reason, and I would point to things like Super Metroid's Sarah Station as well, that not only teach/test you on the game's fundamentals, but hint at the game's themes as well. For Tears of the Kingdom, learning is done through shrines, and the very first shrine that teaches you to use your Bob the Builder arm has two sides separated by a pit. And thus, the first thing you must learn is to build a bridge. Outside of what the player does, we can look at the game's overall design. There are a whole bunch of changes in the sequel that hit at this idea of connecting things together to create something new. The whole game is basically made up of these changes, like the map extension towers, the horses carrying stuff rewind instead of stasis, just to name a few, so I will concentrate on just two major examples. The first is Korok puzzles. In Breath of the Wild, these were one-off encounters where you would do some kind of challenge, and then you would be rewarded with a seed. In Tears of the Kingdom, there is an interesting addition to all of the returning puzzles. Unite the lazy Korok with their friend. So thematically, the gameplay action is one of connection. But just using Ultra Hand to walk one Korok to the other is pretty cumbersome, if not impossible. So usually, you have to engage in some other kind of building to solve the problem efficiently. Where this enters the realm of brilliant is that outside of every single stable, you will find one of these puzzles. Stables within the game act as hubs. You will often choose to go to a stable before venturing out into the unknown areas because it's much easier to use a horse to get around. So naturally, having one of these puzzles right outside of each and every stable is a big nudge nudge wink wink to the player that the proper way to solve this connection problem is through the idea of the ease of movement that horses provide. Of course, for safety reasons, you must create the horse-drawn carriage or some other equivalent, and then your reward for accomplishing this task is one Korok seed plus. Although if anyone from OHS is watching, this guy is fine, okay? Don't worry about it. Every other Korok puzzle is a solitary endeavor, and don't naturally involve building things, and so they reward you with one seed. The ones that do provide two Korok seeds involve not only the theme of connection, but additionally, by virtue of building, showcases how it makes life easier. A less subtle example of what is going on here can be seen with the other factional heroes. In Breath of the Wild, you just went to their lands and helped tame their divine beasts. But here, after you have solved their individual problems, they actually join you. Sure, the game points out that this is spiritual, but these spirits are mechanically identical to the real thing. Their aid in combat is pretty straightforward, providing extra whackety whacks to monsters. But on top of that is the utility they provide throughout the rest of the game. Tulin, for instance, blows a gust of wind to allow you to fly further, and Yunobo lights things on fire and breaks rocks. This extra utility is a reinforcement of that theme of connection. By adventuring together, your life is made easier. This is what I mean when I say that Tears of the Kingdom builds off of what came before. With Breath of the Wild's similarities, it's easier to see just how much more collectivist the sequel is. Compare what Urbosa says when you complete her quest, and the spotlight on her desire for revenge.
I've waited so long for the moment to see you finally rush Hyrule Castle. As well as for the moment when I incinerate Ganon into a pile of ash.
Versus the pledge of fealty that is given by her successor in the sequel.
I, Riju, the Sage of Lightning, swear that I will stand with you.
When you have braved the wild and conquered it, surviving its beasts, its elements, its calamities, what's the next step? What is the sequel to Breath of the Wild? Well, it's Tears of the Kingdom. The next step from survival is societies. It's building things and connecting with others to make life easier. And in addition to that, the use of the champions in Tears of the Kingdom reveals rather subtly, at least for gamer standards, that it's also about successors and descendants. The true test of a kingdom and a large part of why you build is not just for the benefits now, but for the past and the future. So let's move on and talk about the game's vertical space and how it represents time. Chapter 4: Verticality. There is something very aspirational about the sky in Tears of the Kingdom. From the unimpeded clarity of the sun, to sky view towers that launch you upwards as if you were a rocket ship. And the fact that the sky is home to the Zonai and their futuristic technology only solidifies that idea. There is a sense of the future to this space within the game, but there is a flip side, and it's hidden in the other half of the game's vertical space. The depths lie beneath the surface of Hyrule Kingdom and boasts an equal amount of elevation to that of the sky. However, it is shrouded in darkness, so making progress requires you to shoot light everywhere and seek out light routes just merely to see. place is also covered in gloom, which restricts your movement even more. It's just a huge pain in the ass to traverse, which is a direct contrast to the freedom and clarity of the sky. The depths gets criticism for not being fun, but given the theme, I think this is actually a good thing. I think we should be more okay with making the player go through a bad time, because closing ourselves off from half of the emotional canvas does the entire medium a disservice. And in Tears of the Kingdom, this negativity and that grinding nature to movement feels very much on purpose, and I think it is in the gloom that is unique to the depths that shows us why. Gloom comes from the depths, and it affects both people and decays weapons, which is rather curious. When Link gets hit with gloom, he does not take damage in a conventional sense. If he has already taken damage and then is hit with gloom, it doesn't really make anything worse. He just loses the ability to get back to his max, aka back to normal. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that this is an allegory for depression. It is, after all, called gloom. But weapons can't get depression, so what's that all about? Well, the only weapons that are affected are metal, which I thought initially was some kind of rust-based thing, but we don't even need to get that specific. We can just say that gloom causes general weapon degradation, which, regardless of their use, is often just a matter of time. Zonai weapons are immune from this since they are essentially some kind of future technology, and wooden weapons like clubs and sticks are just gathered from the wilds and aren't generally made to last on the same timescale as metal ones. These gloom effects on humans and weapons might not make sense until you factor in the idea that if the sky is a representation of the future, then it follows that the depths are a representation of the past. For weapons, it is that time that degrades them. Indeed, the game itself points this out. It is only in the depths where you will find the weapons in a pristine state. For humans, the story is similar. Things like past glories and nostalgia can prevent you from seeing yourself in the future. And when you can't see a future for yourself, if the light from the sky cannot reach you, then you can never reach your potential. Aspiration is a cure for gloom, and the sky represents that aspirational future. It is a place that is bright and where the sun is always in view. This sunlight helps with gloom, as is explained early on in the game, coming to the surface, and of course the sky removes the gloom effect. Additionally, this quest involving an old lady who has limited mobility shows us that cooking sundelians into a dish and eating them also cures gloom. But interestingly, in the depths, the light immediately near light roots also removes gloom. These have little to do with sunlight, but to me are tied to aspiration. Light is a currency for improvement in this Zelda game. It is no longer the spirit orbs of Breath of the Wild, and these light orbs are acquired in shrines, places of learning and improvement. And if you look at the location of these shrines on the surface, in the depths you will find a light root. Not only that, these light roots are named as backwards versions of their corresponding shrine. Backward in name, perhaps because they are backward in time. Remember how the game opens with an act of archaeology, shining a light on the past using modern understanding and technology. To me, thematically, this is much of what is done in the depths, and the light roots just add to that theming. Through your acts of exploration, you bring the light of the present down to reveal what has been lost to time. If that doesn't convince you that the depths are an allegory for the past, and this verticality of the game's map is being used to represent time, how about this? Breath of the Wild gave us legacy armor, but they were tied to external things like amiibo or DLC. In Tears of the Kingdom, these items are just part of the game, which decouples them from the idea of making money through some kind of external purchase. They're probably being used for a more artistic goal. And do you want to guess where these legacy or nostalgic armor sets are located in Tears of the Kingdom? They are all in the depths. None of them are in the sky, nor the surface. There is also something to be said for the legacy weapons, which add a very interesting wrinkle to the weapon breaking mechanic. Since the game is designed with a limited inventory, you're incentivized to just use weapons, break them, and move on, with the expectations you'll get another one. But these legacy weapons are special, aren't they? I found that I never wanted to get rid of them, not because they are stronger, but just because of the history that they had. Having one of these things break feels wrong. What this meant practically was that I basically just had a bunch of weapons taking up slots that could have been taken up by more powerful ones or ones with more utility. This is the kind of thing that the limited inventory with weapon breaking accomplishes in communication. You may have the freedom to collect, but attaching yourself so much to the past has a cost in potential. You can spend POs to buy back broken legacy weapons, but this also communicates the same idea. Do you really want to spend that resource on these weapons rather than something more useful, like say Muddle Buds? The POs are also the souls of those who have died, so that is another thematic connection between the depths and the past. These legacy weapons, if you let them, become a limiter on your potential, exactly as Gloom functions for your health. This unequivocally makes the game a worse experience. There's no reason they couldn't make these legacy swords function like the Master Sword, for example, existing outside of the slots and rechargeable, or as a collectible checklist style thing, or perhaps even making it so the Master Sword can shapeshift into a legacy look of your choice. But instead, they chose to make the game feel a little worse, because though nostalgia can feel nice, there is certainly a gloom associated with it as well. You can actually solve this problem, but like most natural problems, the solution and the thing that makes your life a little easier is, of course, building. What that last bit shows is just how intertwined and I guess connected various parts of the game are. The depths, as I've shown with Gloom, nostalgia, and the past, manifest themselves in your actual gameplay experience, much like Gloom does to this iteration of Hyrule. And a similar thing is done with the sky. For example, in Breath of the Wild they just had really tall towers that you use to expand the map. In Tears of the Kingdom these were changed to Skyview towers, which offer a more steampunk-ish innovation from the Hylians. It connects the themes of building and futurism, but it also literally shoots Link up like a rocket into that futuristic sky, beautifully connecting themes, aesthetics, mechanics, gameplay, and importantly for this segment, space within the game world. All of these things come together and we can see how the game's vertical space is used to represent time. It's actually mind-boggling to me that they achieved this level of interconnected theming. But there's even more, because you see, there is a limitation here. Using the map to convey time makes it appear like a straight line. But if we look at the game's story, or think about how you actually progress through the game, looping from the sky to the ground to the depths on repeat, I think we'll find that things are actually much more cyclical. Chapter 5. All of this has happened before. Very broadly speaking, this is what happens in Tears of the Kingdom. The prologue sets the stage for the conflict to come. Link wakes up, goes out to explore Hyrule to find Princess Zelda, learns more about the world and the threat of Ganondorf, goes to various parts of the kingdom, helps out the NPCs there, and gets helped in turn until he is powerful enough to fight the big bad guy, Ganondorf, beats him up, usually with Zelda's help, and Hyrule is saved. Hooray! Everyone gets a happy ending. If you're thinking this is woefully undescriptive, you're right. This is, to me, essentially what happens in every The Legend of Zelda, as was pointed out in Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom doing so much that is similar allows us to comprehensively see how the little tweaks to this basic formula gives each game its meaning. This is the easiest to see in the characters. In Breath of the Wild, Ganondorf takes the form of a mindless, destructive force, a calamity. In Tears of the Kingdom, he takes the form of a man, one with unparalleled individual ambition.
I will reshape this world as it was meant to be. I will crush any opposition. I will rule. That is what a king must do.
Zelda spent all of Breath of the Wild holding back a destructive force.
I'm sorry, but my power isn't strong enough. I can't hold it.
Here she is nursing a weapon through generations of time.
I pray. reaches you in the future.
Both can be considered sacrifices, but different in nature. Link and his bridge building shenanigans we covered in the building section, so we don't need to cover it again, but it could equally be placed here in this analysis, which to me shows just how beautifully all of these concepts and themes intertwine in this game. Structurally, the story itself is another repetition between the two games, but Tears of the Kingdom, much like it does with Vertical Space, amplified everything with increased amounts of time. Zelda's sacrifice in Breath of the Wild was what, 100 years? Now it is millennia.
Thousands of years will pass on the blink of an eye. You only delay the inevitable.
This not only makes discovering her memories even more tragic, but by specifically having that part of the story take place in not another world, but specifically the first iteration of Hyrule, you call attention to the overall timeline and all the games that are in between. The repetition and the self-referential nature of the games becomes a bit more meaningful because the paragraph that I used at the start of this segment maps really, really well to other games in the series. Seriously, you could look back at the plot of Ocarina of Time and see for yourself. In broad strokes, it is the exact same thing as these two games. The differences though, the art style, how exactly the story plays out, and the mechanic of time coupled with young and adult Link make it something unique with a distinct message. Ocarina of Time speaks to us of that awkward state in human development in between child and adult. Breath of the Wild speaks to us of the power and forces of nature and how we must adapt and understand it in order to survive. And Tears of the Kingdom speaks to us about what happens after that, building things with our own hands, coming together to form societies, and the greater reward that comes when we do so. All of this has happened before, and despite how that might sound, it isn't a bad thing, at least from this meta perspective. Tears of the Kingdom shows us, despite the formula, how these games are instilled with the kind of magic that has made the series as influential and long-standing as it is. Knowing this, it's not too hard to imagine a possible future Zelda game, perhaps something more whimsical, themed around pirates and the open seas, where instead of ambition, Ganondorf is just a man who's envious and wants revenge on Hyrule for their relative peace. Zelda is the leader of a pirate crew, and Link is, some schmuck who wakes up. Yeah, right, yep, sorry, yep, they made that one already. Anyway, look, you get the idea. This is a small part of the Zelda formula, and these are the types of things you tweak in their aesthetics and context to change what that formula gives you in terms of meaning. To give a real example though, I think it's really easy to imagine a cyberpunk Zelda game where Ganon is some corporate CEO, Zelda is the leader of some resistance movement, and Link is a robot with the mysterious power to be unaffected by the digital control mechanisms of a skyscraper-filled neon Hyrule. Nintendo's development philosophy is gameplay first, so let's not dwell too much on a game that will probably never be made and refocus on Tears of the Kingdom. I know that in this exercise I've been a bit reductive to its story, which is a shame because it does do some rather artful things which I will attempt to rectify now. The opening of the game has Zelda disappearing into the depths, while Link wakes up in the sky. There is a certain symmetry here that is rather neat, especially given the connection of the vertical space representing time. Zelda ends up in the past, and Link essentially in the future, and the goal for both characters is to traverse that space-time to find one another. Link must dive down in physical space, and Zelda must traverse forward in time. Zelda ends up in the sky, and Link, about to face Ganondorf, ends up in the depths. And also, a lot of what Link does during the game is an act of uncovering the past. As Link builds the connections required to form his band of heroes and restores this iteration of Hyrule, Zelda witnesses the fall of the one in the past and connects with the heroes of that time, asking them to pledge their powers to descendants who they will never meet. Link sends back the broken Master Sword at the Temple of Time in the hope that it will somehow be repaired, And at the end of one of the main quest lines involving the investigation of these glyphs that scar the landscape, Link finds the Dragon of Light, and the full weight of the tragedy of Zelda's sacrifice comes into view. In the past, Zelda has to solve two dilemmas: get herself back to her Hyrule in the future, and heal the Master Sword. Even though she knows what it will do to her, she decides to sacrifice her sanity and sense of self, and endure a millennia of suffering, all for the hope that Link would come good in the future. Another really neat duality is set up in the final part of the game. First, I want to point out the reinforcement of the theme of collectivism versus individualism. On the way to Ganondorf, you must traverse the depths of Hyrule Castle, and down there you lose the ability to use the spirit versions of your companions. This, much like Gloom, just makes the game worse to play from a fun perspective. But the added difficulty of this section really drives home the game's stance that working together makes life easier. Link then faces off against an army of Ganon's minions, but that help arrives. The descendant heroes coming good on their promise.
You don't have to fight all by yourself, you know?
After that, they hold off the game's sub-bosses by themselves to allow Link the age-old showdown with Ganondorf. I want to take some time out here to point out just how much the developers know what they're doing, okay? Ganondorf is the big bad guy, yeah? Visually and through dialogue, we kind of get it. It's end boss stuff happening right now. But this is basic. If you really want to flex your understanding of something, you break the rules. How many hit points something has tells us how tough they will be. Now, we're never given a number for these things, just a standardized bar that initially hovers over the top of the minions that occupy the world. But then you will come across a boss, and their health bars will be locked into your UI. Such is the risk they pose. In Breath of the Wild, Calamity Ganon shares that same visual indicator, which makes him seem like every other boss in the game. Things are different in Tears of the Kingdom. We get a nice slow build for anticipation, but then the bar hits the point where we expect it to go, and then it just keeps going. They didn't recenter it or anything because they want you to know purely through UI, through the video game convention of a health bar, that Ganondorf is such a threat that he breaks the rules of bosses. That is how much of a boss he is. When the 1v1 doesn't go Ganondorf's way, he brings out his phantoms, and it should be no surprise, but this is when the other heroes come back in to tip the scales in the fight, which contrasts quite nicely with the previous game where they stayed in their beasts and just shot a beam at him, and that's about it. Ganondorf, being a pretty terrible loser as he was in the past, makes a sacrifice of his own and swallows his stone. Oh hey, that's exactly what Zelda did. But remember, the lesson that Tears of the Kingdom instilled is to focus on what is not the same. And this act is differentiated by Ganondorf's individual desire for power and Zelda's hope and faith in others. And so, in grand fashion, the fight takes to the skies, and a battle between these two ideas takes place. This battle is really cool, not just for the theming, or the fact that, you're fighting a dragon alongside another dragon, but the use of verticality in this final battle really makes it feel like a culmination of everything the game was sold as. This is a battle in which you never touch the ground, and as you might fear plummeting from those heights, have faith, because Zelda will be there to catch you. And also, while we're here, this is another example of the developers knowing exactly what they're doing, because they set this up. The first intended boss, Colgera, is also a never-touch-the-ground type dealie. Oh, and if you're wondering why the health bar has gone back to normal here, even though Dragon Ganondorf should be a lot stronger, it's because the threat of Ganondorf as a dragon is offset by Zelda fighting alongside you. After Link and the Dragon of Light defeat Ganondorf, something rather unexpected and potentially unsatisfying happens. Link loses Ultra Hand and Zelda somehow magically returns back to normal. Chapter 6, Deus Ex Machina. Alright, so this is the definition of a Deus Ex Machina, and they often feel quite unsatisfying to a modern audience because they are seen as a tool for lazy writers to force an outcome without the due diligence of setting them up. Draconification, we are eventually told by Minoru, is a permanent transformation.
To become an immortal dragon is to lose oneself. It would mean throwing yourself away. Oh, Minoru! You won't be able to change back.
And so Zelda returning to normal suddenly here is a Deus Ex Machina. But I think the reason it works is much like the reason it was used in the first place. In ancient Greece, the gods were always messing about in those stories, and they are about as active in The Legend of Zelda. In Tears of the Kingdom, especially, the goddess statues serve as a direct gateway for your improvement. The act of leveling up or getting stronger is typically left to the player. Most games do it in menus. Previous games in this series used to just apply things as soon as you got them with heart containers, but now your currency for improvement are light orbs, which you must offer to the goddess first. A consistent tick throughout the game of godly interference, but something that is gated through what one could consider to be an act of faith. If you think about my summary of the events of Tears of the Kingdom, many of the actions that characters take, sending the Master Sword back through time, swallowing the Power Stone, pledging your powers to descendants to fight a battle in the distant future, and allowing your companions to take on bosses on their own, can all be looked at as acts of faith. This time though, it is a faith in other people that allows you to progress in the rebuilding of Hyrule Kingdom. It seems like the game is fused together with faith, an idea that if you sacrifice something for others, whether it be light orbs, time, effort, or your sanity, it won't have been wasted. I get the sense looking at this quote from the developers that Breath of the Wild was a risk that paid off, an act of faith that all of these conventions they were breaking and their new physics and chemistry engines would be rewarded by the audience. It was only once the players followed through and showed the world their novel solutions to problems that the developers were rewarded for their sacrifice. I think this explains a bit why Tears of the Kingdom has so much faith infused throughout, and why the acts of sacrifice are always rewarded. The developers went through something similar, and it has been infused into their work. So when they come in at the end to make their will known, it shouldn't be all that surprising. It's what happens next, though, that we really need to talk about, because there is one more entity with godlike powers that's messing around in the game that the developers rightfully give the spotlight. Right after Rauru and Sonia appear to revert the duo back to normal and then fade away, Tears of the Kingdom references a very famous work of art, The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. Even though Zelda and Link are plummeting toward the ground, the game essentially pauses and asks you to interact, to actively reach out to Zelda. Now, you may be thinking, Tomo, mate, this is exactly the same thing as in The Last of Us Part 2. So surely you have similar complaints. I don't. I just don't. And I think it's because of this key difference. Link is not a character the same way Ellie is a character. Ellie was created with a life and emotions and a backstory that leads her to do things that we as players have no control over, and shouldn't have control over. Link is named Link because he is our link into Hyrule Kingdom, so that we can enact our will upon it.
結構ね、青沼さんはリンクでもいいやなんですけど、僕らその最初の作った時は、リンクっていうのはこう人と人とか技術と人とか、それからトライフォースとかそれをつないでいく人でリンクっていう名前にしたんですよ。
知ってますよそれは。
Within the game of Tears of the Kingdom, but in basically all Zeldas, our actions, the order in which we tackle dungeons, who we choose to help, the rewards and benefits we seek are our choices, not Link's. This moment is a representation of our desire to save Zelda, so us engaging or refusing to engage with the interactivity are both consistent. If you think that's cope, let us return and analyze the game's use of reference, where Link, aka we, are framed in God's position, reaching out to create the life that is Zelda. It is a literal Deus Ex Machina used not for convenience, but to point out our godlike powers and recognition of our will upon the game world. And while we're here, we may as well talk about the other scenes in which interactivity injection is used as well. The lifting of the Master Sword and the final blow to Dragon Ganon. These don't have the benefit of the god framing, so Last of Us Part 2 fans might perk up and say, aha! These contradict what you say! But the problem is they work in a similar way. Just as reaching out to Zelda references the biblical creation myth, so does dealing the final blow to Ganon appear to reference the Japanese creation myth. And of course, the lifting of the Master Sword references the Arthurian legend. The murals found underneath Hyrule Kingdom act as snapshots to tell us of a legend of the past, the one of the creation of the Kingdom of Hyrule. And as we play through Tears of the Kingdom, these moments that reference other legends inject interactivity to force the cutscene to pause. And the result of that is that we get a snapshot, a frame of the legend which might adorn its own mural in a future game. And once that has been acknowledged, as players linked into this myth making, we have the power to set things back into motion. One of the hallmarks of gaming as an art form is interactivity. It's the only thing that meaningfully differentiates the player and everything else that is within the canvas, or screen in this case. It makes you God, particularly in a game like The Legend of Zelda. The world changes purely on your actions, but the games themselves are never called The Legend of Link or Tales of the Great Swordsman. They are The Legend of Zelda. The games we play are merely to take part in her story, Zelda's legend. Hello, Editing Tommy here, and this is going to be a bit jarring, especially given how I start off the next bit. But I wanted to interject and just point out that there's even more evidence to support the idea that this is Zelda's story, essentially, within the game's world. Because in the epilogue, the moment that is given to most protagonists, where they dedicate themselves to the cause and, rouse their allies to join them, is not given to Link, but it is given to Zelda.
I will dedicate myself to that goal. Now, and for all time. My friends, with all of your strength, stand with me.
I don't think people realize just how profoundly good this use of reference is. Not only does it communicate what I just said on the micro level with Link being a god, or a macro level about that interactivity allowing the story to be created and then experienced, but on the meta level, it speaks beautifully of something that is fundamental to the medium. If anyone has delved into a game engine and tried to make a level, you'll know that a lot of what you do is playing around with, placing, and combining game objects. That is the power a developer has over the game world's construction. Often, we take it for granted as players that the powers we receive are either a part of the character or a part of the world. But remember how I said that Ultra Hand feels like a dumbed-down development tool? As the greater gods, the developers have bestowed some of their power to us, I suspect, to make it clearer how much more power and control you have in this world than anyone else. Even the powers of your companions are not theirs alone. Once you have done their quests, the rings of Ultra Hand give you their abilities to use for yourself. So it is a bit odd that it's something that they take away from you at this moment, right? Well, One of the things of note about Michelangelo's creation of Adam is that there is this gap between the fingers of God and man. The artist, by virtue of the limitations of the medium, has to depict but one moment, one frame of this biblical event. And so, Michelangelo chose to have a gap. Some will say that this is to imply some kind of unseen electricity that actually makes the contact. Others will say that this is due to the imperfection of man, never actually reaching God or some such or whatever. It's not really that important. Either way, the gap is there for Michelangelo's creation of Adam. But for Tears of the Kingdom's creation of Zelda, that gap can be and is closed explicitly and intentionally by the interactivity of the player. As the god within this game, you as Link, by reaching out and saving Zelda, create the story and her legend within the game's world. If you choose not to engage with that interactivity, that gap remains forever, and you're left with essentially just a frame. By taking away Ultra Hand, there is no ambiguity. This moment is about your ability as a player to press a button and change what happens on screen. The fact that you can interact with the world at all makes you a god. It is in the mere act of interaction, the thing that makes gaming its own distinct medium, that allows us to bridge that gap. It allows us to surpass the creation of Adam, something considered one of the best works of art in human history, which is evidenced by the many parodies and references in other media. You are the god in the machine, and when you use your godlike powers to win some frivolous, carnival-esque game, reunite a lazy Korok with their companion, or stop a sign from falling, you are rewarded. And this is also reflected on the larger scale when you go through the effort of completing the game and defeating Ganondorf. Your reward is saving Zelda, and everything that comes with that. And I do mean you. Much of what happens next, when Zelda wakes, is her breaking the fourth wall, looking straight down the barrel of the camera and addressing the player. For those who have followed through with the faith the developers handed to them and actually complete this iteration of the legend, are given the reward of saving Zelda from that eternity of suffering.
I have so much to tell you. So much happened. Oh, Link. I'm home.
However, despite how this ending appears, all of this has happened before. Chapter 7. All of this has happened before, and will happen again. Apparently for some people, Zelda having to suffer for an eternity would give her sacrifice more meaning. Now, I have hopefully done enough to point out why this doesn't really work, but there's even more that makes that a bad idea. Remember the title of this game? It's Tears of the Kingdom, and what the Draconification does mechanically is allow Zelda's memories to survive on a similar timescale to that of Kingdoms. It's there to massage our brains and connect the personal tragedy of Zelda, who is much easier to empathize with, and connect that to the Kingdom of Hyrule, so that we may be able to decode exactly what the tears in Tears of the Kingdom is referring to. And if you were to ask me, it's these floating platforms in the sky that are the Tears of the Kingdom. We can discern this if we think about the Tears of the Dragon. The tears falling from the sky are scattered around Hyrule, and once collected, give you memories that detail a moment in the past. And when taken all together, tell a tragic story of the fall of Hyrule. Remember that Tears of the Kingdom often uses repetition to point something out, and this pattern repeats. There is actually a quest given by, wouldn't you know it, a historian that does more or less the same thing. These Zonai platforms in the sky are scattered all over the map, holding stone tablets that, when translated, detail a moment in the past, and when taken all together, tell a tragic story of the fall of Hyrule. Some of these platforms also break off and fall to the ground, much like Zelda's Tears. And so, this parallel makes the Kingdom of Hyrule personable, a being in its own right, capable of a sense of tragedy. Remember how I mentioned earlier that every legacy armor set is located in the depths? There are two very interesting things of note here. One is that this isn't actually true. The Majora's Mask Fierce Deity armor set is located on the surface, as is the Awakening armor set. This might seem contradictory, but if we actually look at Majora's Mask and Link's Awakening, almost none of the Zelda formula applies, aka no Zelda, no Ganondorf. But the one we are interested in here is that they do not take place in Hyrule Kingdom, and so have not been squashed down in the depths like everything else. And I do mean everything else, because the second thing of note is that the legacy armor sets that are found in the depths includes Breath of the Wild's armor set. Which is odd, right? Because isn't Tears of the Kingdom's Hyrule meant to be the exact same, since it's a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild? And, uses the same map and everything? Well, remember shrines? The idea for those originated in Breath of the Wild, and so Tears of the Kingdom's shrines have their roots in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. And those roots are found in the depths, along with the armor set of its Link. Here's another example on the meta layer. The art style of these games was chosen after they made HD versions of previous ones, and it's only the Wind Waker that was ultimately chosen. The rest of the history in that work was discarded. But even then, the cartooniness was toned down to perfectly match the goals of the new game. It's a constant cycle of construction and deconstruction, and I think just as the developers of these later Zelda games are aware of this, much like the other themes, it ends up being infused into the work, into Hyrule Kingdom itself. This is what Tears of the Kingdom adds to the deconstruction of the series that started with Breath of the Wild. That Hyrule itself will be left behind, turned into sludge, and the next Hyrule will be made on top of it, even a direct sequel. Just like there will always be a new Zelda, a new Link, and a new Ganondorf, so there will be a new Hyrule Kingdom, as a board for those pieces to play out essentially the same story. And what this flattening of that history reveals is that much of that lore, this timeline that fans will fixate on, doesn't really matter. There is no Dragon of Light in the skies of Wind Waker or Ocarina of Time, even though they take place in between the first iteration of Hyrule and Tears of the Kingdom. And speaking of Ocarina of Time, this was Rauru, the Sage of Time, and this is him now in Tears of the Kingdom. So, even if Zelda was a dragon and her sacrifice made true, there is every reason to believe it would be ignored in the next Zelda game. After all, the next Legend of Zelda will have its own specific story to tell that probably has nothing to do with the Dragon of Light in the sky. And focusing on Zelda misses the real tragedy.
The games keep getting bigger, and better, and I'm wondering if, a few years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, where do you see all of this going?
Chapter 8. The Gloom in the Sky.
なるともう完全に僕は無理なので彼に
いやいや、全然僕も無理だ。
彼が答えるべき。
I'm not gonna be around. It's definitely gotta be him answering the question.
難しいよな、本当に。未来のことは本当に分からなくて。
Game Informer has a really nice interview on their YouTube channel with Miyamoto and Aonuma that is really illustrative of why I think Tears of the Kingdom is so good. The video basically covers what seems to be a changing of the guard at Nintendo. and how the legends that helped create the properties that are still going strong to this day are passing on their expertise to their successors.
So is the overall lesson you're trying to impart then is to trust the skeletons that you've been working with for 30 years, trust those core ideas, and then keep layering on top of that, but keep those intact?
スピリットとしてこう伝わっていくのがよくて、今までの伝統芸能のように守れっていうことでは全然ないんですね。
若い人たちが僕らに対してどう接してほしいかって言ったら、僕らのその視点っていうものをね。
Much of what Tears of the Kingdom says about Hyrule Kingdom and its history also applies to the kingdom of Nintendo. Making games, of course, requires building and the cooperation of talented individuals. Miyamoto also talks about a skeleton that is used, much like how a formula might be used. We have questions of legacy and the potential restrictions that come with that legacy.
I'd imagine it's tough for that younger generation to go with the flow when they know that there are these legendary game creators above them. How much wiggle room can you have under the eyes of some of the most important game creators of all time?
But Miyamoto and Aonuma seem to have plenty of faith in the newer developers and their skill set. And so the future looks bright.
いろんな表現が出てくるけど OKOK って割と僕はおおらかに認めてるんですよ。だから今すごく若い人たちと上の人たちのノウハウの伝達がうまくいってますよね。
Looking more specifically at The Legend of Zelda, though, with its more built-in sense of repetition and its history, we have an even greater parallel to what the developers have done in Tears of the Kingdom. For instance, I find it really interesting that skeleton comment, given Tears of the Kingdom's quests to discover, well, skeletons. It's also rather curious that the surface of Hyrule does not have a Zonite mine. The raw material that powers much of what is new in Tears of the Kingdom is only placed in the depths and in the sky. And for The Legend of Zelda, the raw materials for making a new game are mined from the series' history, fused with new ideas and technology. Indeed, that is what was showcased in the creation of Breath of the Wild, the prototype using the assets from the original but combined with ideas from the future. You might say that they did that to keep things simple, but they could have used assets from any 2D Zelda. They didn't have to go with the very first one. Which reminds me of what happened in Tears of the Kingdom and its use of the first iteration of Hyrule as well.
A time so far back in the past, it's become legend. So it's true. This is really the era of Hyrule's founding?
Something that they also didn't need to do. Hyrule has been destroyed and rebuilt so many times they could have placed it basically anywhere, or just not mentioned that it was the first one. What I'm trying to get at with all of this, other than throwing in a bunch of neat little connections that didn't make it into the other sections, is to point out the meta-ness of Tears of the Kingdom. Usually when we get this level of self-reference, we begin to use the label of self-aware. Breath of the Wild did this too, but its ambition was to merely strip away what was not essential and get back to the core of what the series was. And in doing so, they ended up making a world, a Hyrule that was more free and alive than has been experienced before. But meat has to be put onto that skeleton, and Tears of the Kingdom gives us that more fully fledged character, and not intent to just be a better game. It also elevates its commentary, pointing out how the repetition in the series is used, but also applies that repetition on the meta level to the timeline of the series as a whole, making it more of a cycle.
I am the daughter of King Rome of Hyrule, Zelda.
What an unexpected answer. We are the king and queen who founded Hyrule, after all. Or at least we were the last time I checked.
And again, if you think I'm just off my rocker or whatever, check out the official website for the timeline. Every game is traceable via a line to another game. You know, like a linear history. But when we get to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that line of connection becomes a separator. And you know how I keep bringing up that we should remember the title of the game? Well, let's do that one more time. but look a little deeper at the symbology used around it. And oh, wouldn't you know it, there's an Ouroboros, a symbol used to represent an endless repeating cycle. We all know by now that Link, Zelda, and Ganon are destined to forever play out this story, but on the larger scale, so too is the Kingdom of Hyrule. And on the scale above that one, the meta layer, this too is true. What Miyamoto, among many others, have done is built a kingdom of games that has such a strong core that it will outlive them. And there will be a day where a new Legend of Zelda is released and Miyamoto won't be alive to see it. It would seem the clarity of the future is not entirely made up of sunshine after all. One thing that struck me a little bit with these memory tablets in the sky is that you have to take pictures of them. The goal, of course, is to preserve what was written so that we can get them translated. It reveals a fragility that we might not associate with kingdoms, and through our act of preservation, we can give strength to its memory so that others can view them as well into the future. This made me think about the other ways the photo-taking mechanic is used in the game. We are tasked with cataloging the world's items, its creatures, and in its own little set of quests, its landscape. I wouldn't have thought this at the time, but filling these empty frames inside of each of these stables now feels like an act of preservation. It's as if current Hyrule, a world that Nintendo breathed new life into and given a sense of self-awareness, knows how little of it will remain in the end. Whether it be by the hands of Ganondorf or by the developers themselves, much of its beauty inevitably stripped away, if not being forgotten entirely. This is what is written into the very fabric of the world. All of that vertical space, despite representing opposite time and emotion, for the Kingdom of Hyrule, says the same thing. The depths are a wasteland filled with historical gloom, but equally the sky, despite its bright futurism, is just as barren. And that aspect of time is what makes this truly tragic, because even in the space that is meant to represent an aspirational future, for this Hyrule Kingdom, looking to the sky to see its destiny, it will find nothing but ruins.